You asked for the best marksman. You didn't ask who looked like one. The words hit the range like a thunderclap. Sergeant Major Rourke had just finished mocking her in front of 40 soldiers pointing at the quiet woman at the back, laughing, telling her that reading numbers didn't make someone a shooter. The soldiers laughed with him. Dawson smirked. Nobody expected her to answer. Nobody expected her to walk to that rifle rack, pick up an unfamiliar weapon, and expose a mechanical fault that every certified instructor on that range had completely missed. In 60 seconds, she didn't just silence the laughter. She changed everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be the best. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning fog hadn't fully lifted from the mountain when Sergeant Major Thomas Rourke stepped out onto the elevated platform at the edge of the firing range and looked down at the 40 soldiers standing in the gravel below him. He had run this evaluation before. He had run it 7 times in the past 11 years, and he knew exactly what it was supposed to look like. He knew the sounds, boots on stone, the rattle of gear, the low competitive murmuring that moved through a group of qualified soldiers, the way electricity moves through wire. He knew the faces, the ones who were ready, the ones who were pretending, the ones who had trained for this moment, and the ones who had trained for the idea of this moment, which was an entirely different thing. 40 soldiers, 12 positions, 1 Overwatch unit that would be deployed to protect medical teams and evacuation crews operating in some of the most isolated and unforgiving terrain in the country. Rourke crossed his arms and let the silence settle before he spoke. "I'm going to ask you one question," he said, "and I want honest answers. Not brave answers, not the answer you think I want to hear. Honest ones." He paused. "Who is the best marksman standing here today?" The hands went up fast, 7, 8, 10 of them. Confident, immediate, the kind of hand that goes up before the sentence is even finished. Staff Sergeant Luke Dawson raised his in one smooth motion and took a single step forward, which was exactly the kind of thing Luke Dawson would do, and everyone on that range knew it. Dawson had been the base shooting champion for 2 consecutive years. He was built like someone who had been designed specifically to win marksmanship competitions, broad-shouldered, calm-eyed, with the kind of jaw that seemed to square itself whenever anyone was watching. The soldiers around him made a small sound of approval, the kind of sound a crowd makes when the obvious answer walks to the front of the room. Rourke nodded slowly. He was not surprised. What he hadn't expected was the figure at the back of the group. She was standing far to the left, maybe 3 steps behind the last row, and she wasn't watching him. She was watching the tree line. She had a small notebook pressed flat against her left forearm, and she was writing in it with her right hand, not quickly, not nervously, just steadily, the way a person writes when they are recording something precise. She wore a plain training jacket, olive drab, with no unit patches visible, and the collar was turned up at the front so that whatever rank insignia might have been sewn to her chest was completely hidden. Rourke looked at her for a moment. She didn't look up. "You in the back," he said. She continued writing. "I'm talking to the woman with the notebook." She looked up then, and her eyes were entirely calm, not challenging, not dismissive, just calm the way a person looks when they've been interrupted in the middle of something they intended to finish. "I heard you, Sergeant Major," she said. "Then why isn't your hand up?" "Because you asked for the best marksman," she said, "not the person most willing to say they are." There was a silence that lasted maybe 4 seconds, which on a firing range full of competitive soldiers feels considerably longer. Then somebody laughed. Then several people laughed. Rourke heard Dawson make a sound that was more smirk than chuckle, and he heard at least 2 people near the front mutter something to each other. He didn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. The tone was enough. Rourke stepped down from the platform. He walked slowly the way men who have spent 30 years in command walk when they want to make sure everyone can see them thinking. He stopped about 8 feet from the woman with the notebook. "You're the technical observer from the evaluation support team," he said. It was not a question. "I was assigned to the range this morning," she said, which was technically a complete answer without being the answer he had assumed. Rourke tilted his head. Reading numbers on a clipboard doesn't make someone a marksman. She didn't blink. "No, Sergeant Major, it doesn't. So what makes you think you can stand here and question 40 experienced soldiers who just raised their hands. She looked at him with that same flat, unhurried calm. You asked who the best marksman was. You didn't ask who looked like one. The range went completely silent. Rourke felt the moment shift around him. He'd been in enough rooms and on enough ranges to know when something had changed, when the air pressure of a situation moved in a direction nobody expected. He felt it now. And the part of him that had spent 30 years building a reputation for never being caught off guard by anything made a decision that the analytical part of him would later admit was pride masquerading as confidence. Prove it, he said. She closed her notebook. She looked at the rifle rack to her right, the row of weapons that had been checked out for the evaluation. Not her personal equipment, not a weapon she had zeroed herself, not anything she had ever held before that morning. She walked to the rack, lifted the nearest rifle, and turned it over once in her hands slowly the way a mechanic looks at a car someone else has been driving. Is the maintenance record on this weapon current? She asked. One of the range assistants looked at Rourke. Rourke waved a hand. Everything on that rack has been cleared. That's not what I asked, she said, still looking at the rifle. I asked if the maintenance record is current. It's fine, the assistant said, but his voice had the particular texture of a man answering a question he hasn't fully verified. She nodded as if she had expected exactly that answer. She didn't argue. She walked to the primary firing position, set her footing, checked the chamber, looked down range, and then did something none of the watching soldiers anticipated. She stopped. She stood completely still with the rifle at low ready and stared at the terrain downrange for close to 30 seconds. Not at the target, at the space between them and the target. She watched the dust near a low rock formation about halfway out. She looked at the highest visible tree on the left ridge and watched the branches. She looked at the thermometer mounted on the range safety post and then back at the valley floor. Dawson, standing 3 positions to her left, watched her with an expression that was beginning to slide from amusement towards something more careful. She raised the weapon, settled into her stance, and fired. The round landed outside the center, not by much but enough to be clearly visible on the scoring display. A few soldiers exhaled. Someone near the back made a sound that was the sound of a tension releasing. Rourke had already begun to open his mouth. She spoke first. The optic mount is loose, she said. The weapon is pulling left on recoil. If I had to estimate, I'd say the mount has shifted roughly 4 to 5 minutes of angle over probably the last 30 or 40 rounds fired through this barrel. She paused. Sergeant Major, I'd like Staff Sergeant Dawson to fire the same weapon from the same position before anyone adjusts anything. Rourke stared at her. You're making excuses, he said. I'm making an observation, she said. There's a difference. One of them is useful. Dawson looked at Rourke. Rourke, after a pause that nobody on that range would ever fully admit they noticed, gave him a nod. Dawson stepped into the position. He was a professional. His form was excellent, feet exactly right, breathing controlled, trigger discipline, clean. He fired once. The round landed slightly left of center, nearly identical to her impact. Nobody laughed this time. Rourke turned to his range assistant. Check that mount. The assistant checked it. He ran his thumbnail along the side of the optic bracket and stopped. He looked up at Rourke with an expression that said several things at once, none of them comfortable. It's loose, Sergeant Major. The locking screw on the rear mount is about a half turn from where it should be. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Thomas Rourke had experienced in 11 years of running that range. He had expected to humiliate her. Not cruelly, he would have told himself it wasn't cruelty, it was discipline. It was efficiency. It was making sure that someone who didn't belong on an operational evaluation understood that belonging had to be earned. But the result he had intended was her embarrassment and the restoration of order. He had expected a bad shot followed by a quiet withdrawal. He had not expected this. The assistant tightened the mount. Rourke did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said simply, fire again. She stepped back into position. Same stillness, same 30-second reading of the environment. Then the shot. Center. Not close to center. Not in the scoring ring closest to center. Center. The kind of center that doesn't happen by accident at 800 yards with an unfamiliar weapon on a range you've never fired before. Dawson watched the scoring display. His expression was not angry. It was the careful, slightly stunned expression of a genuinely excellent competitor who has just realized the field is different than he thought. Rourke said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, You'll stay for the full evaluation. It was not an invitation, it was closer to a concession. Thank you, Sergeant Major, she said, and she said it without any satisfaction in her voice, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd said it with all of it. Her name was Major Claire Bennett, but Rourke didn't know that yet because she hadn't shown him her identification. She was wearing a jacket with her rank covered, and she had signed into the range that morning on a line that listed her as evaluation support personnel, which was not a lie but was not the entire truth. And the reason for that was something she had decided weeks ago in a meeting that had taken place far from Fort Granite, in a building where people talked quietly about the difference between what military records said and what military personnel could actually do when the moment required it. She wasn't at Fort Granite just to compete. She was there because 3 soldiers from this base had been deployed to a joint rescue exercise 6 weeks earlier, and all 3 of them had frozen. Not hesitated, not struggled, frozen. Completely dangerously, with lives depending on them, frozen. And their qualification records said they shouldn't have. Their records said they were exactly the kind of people you could trust with exactly that kind of pressure. Someone had made those records wrong, and Claire Bennett had been asked to find out who and why and whether it was going to happen again. But none of that was visible yet. What was visible was a woman with a notebook and a borrowed rifle and a shot that nobody on that range was going to be able to explain away. Rourke walked back to the platform. He stopped next to Master Sergeant Raymond Torres, who had been watching the whole thing from the far end of the range with the carefully arranged expression of a man who is working very hard not to show what he is thinking. You know her, Rourke asked quietly. I've seen people shoot like that, Torres said. Not many. That's not what I asked. No, Torres said, it's not. Rourke looked at him for a moment. Then he let it go. He had an evaluation to run 12 positions to fill, and a morning schedule already running 20 minutes behind. Whatever Claire Bennett was, she had earned her place in the evaluation. He would deal with the rest of it later. What he didn't know yet was that there was no version of later where dealing with it would be simple. The evaluation moved into its second stage. The range assistants reset the target system, and Rourke briefed the new parameters. Wind was increasing from the northwest, he told them. Distances would vary. Some targets would move. They had 4 minutes to engage a sequence of threats while protecting a simulated position. Dawson went first. He was everything his reputation said. He was controlled, decisive, efficient. He tracked a moving target at 600 yards and hit it on the third frame of movement, which was faster than anyone had a right to be with shifting wind. The soldiers around him watched with the particular kind of attention that people give to excellence when excellence is undeniable. Claire shot in the middle of the group, which meant nobody was watching her with the focused attention they'd given Dawson. But Torres was. Torres had positioned himself at an angle where he could see both the scoring display and her station simultaneously, and he watched her work through the sequence with a quality of concentration that he recognized not from other competitions, but from other investigations. Because what she was doing was not just shooting. Every time she engaged a target, she was reading the display first. Not to see the score, to see the timing. And Torres noticed, because he was the kind of person who noticed things like this, that she was writing in her notebook between engagements. Small notes, quick. He couldn't see what they said, but he could see that she was recording something other than her own performance. Dawson came over to Torres after his stage. She's good, Dawson said. He said it the way you say a thing when saying it costs you something. She's really good, but she's not unbeatable. Did I say she was? Torres asked. Nobody had to say it. Half these guys looked at that first shot and started wondering if they belong here. Torres watched Claire lower her weapon between targets. What do you think about how she shoots? Dawson was quiet for a moment. She doesn't shoot like she's competing, he said finally. She shoots like she's looking for something. Torres didn't answer that, but he filed it away. The third stage was physical, timed run, up a steep service road 200 meters, followed by an immediate shooting sequence at targets that appeared as soon as you stopped moving. Most competitive shooters practice this drill. It was a physical tax designed to measure how well someone's technique survived exhaustion, because in the field you were never fresh when you needed to be accurate. Dawson was brilliant at it. His heart rate came down visibly within seconds of stopping. You could see it in his breathing, in the way his shoulders settled, and his first round was almost as clean as if he'd shot from rest. Claire was not as fast on the run. She was fit, clearly, but she was 41 years old and she wasn't competing in a speed event. She came up the road about 15 seconds behind Dawson's pace, took her position, and before she fired, she looked at something on the ground near the target berm. She did not fire immediately. "Why has she stopped?" one of the soldiers near Rourke said. Rourke was already watching. "Bennett," he called out, "the clock is running." "I see that, Sergeant Major," she called back. "There is a maintenance vehicle on the access road behind the target berm. I am not going to fire until I can confirm it has moved." Rourke looked at the access road. There was indeed a vehicle there, a small utility truck that was supposed to have been cleared from the range sector before this stage began. It had not been. "The vehicle is outside the impact zone," Rourke said. "The vehicle is adjacent to the ricochet corridor for the third target from the left at this angle," she said. "I'd like it moved." Rourke looked at the range assistant nearest him. The assistant did a quick calculation, the kind where you look at angles and distances and the position of things that aren't supposed to be where they are, and his expression shifted. "She's right," the assistant said quietly. "If she catches the edge of that third target, the ricochet corridor runs within about 40 feet of the vehicle." Rourke keyed his radio. The vehicle moved. Claire waited. The clock was still running. She would lose significant time on this stage. She didn't rush when she finally shot. She hit 4 or 5 targets cleanly and took the point deduction for time without any visible reaction. When she walked back down the road, Dawson was standing at the bottom with his arms crossed. Not because he was angry, because he was thinking. "You cost yourself the stage," he said. "I know," she said. "Why, boy?" She looked at him directly. "Because the other option was firing toward an occupied vehicle." The assistant said it was 40 feet clear. The assistant calculated the expected ricochet vector. She said, "I was thinking about the unexpected one." Dawson looked at her for a long moment. He had been a soldier for 14 years. He had competed in more evaluations than he could count. He had never once in all of that time had a conversation like this one on a firing range. It made him feel something he wasn't fully prepared to name, which was the particular discomfort of realizing that the thing you are very good at is not the only thing that matters. He walked away without answering. Torres appeared at Claire's shoulder. "You're collecting something," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. "I'm watching the evaluation." "You're watching more than that," he said. "The timing discrepancy on the electronic display. The missing calibration node on the second target system. You're writing things down that have nothing to do with your score." She held his gaze for a moment. "You're observant, Master Sergeant." "I've been around long enough," he said. "Is there something I should know?" "There might be," she said. "Are you someone who does something with things they know?" Torres considered that for a moment with the careful seriousness of a man who understood exactly what she was asking. "Yes," he said. "Then watch the scoring display during the 4th stage," she said. "Pay attention to when the system registers an impact relative to when you hear the physical sensor confirm it." She walked away. Torres stood in the gravel and thought about that for a long moment. Then he walked to a position where he could see the display clearly, and he waited and he watched. The 4th stage began, and the electronic display registered something 7/10 of a second before the physical confirmation reached it. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing that could be explained in a dozen ordinary ways: system lag, calibration offset, environmental interference. Torres was not an electronics expert, but he was a man who had spent 22 years learning to recognize the difference between things that could be explained innocently and things that were being explained away. He wrote the time in the margin of his stage sheet and said nothing. And Captain Aaron Blake, who had been standing at the edge of the observation deck all morning with a cup of coffee and a very careful expression, watched Torres write something down and felt the first real thread of cold move through his chest. He had told himself the numbers were temporary. He had told himself the soldiers would improve. He had told himself that the institution mattered more than one honest evaluation cycle. He had told himself all of it so many times that it had started to feel like truth. But the woman with a notebook was still writing. And now Torres was writing too. And somewhere in the back of his mind, past all the justifications and the rationalizations and the quiet confidence that he had covered his tracks well enough, Blake understood that the morning was changing. He just didn't know yet how completely. Inside the range office, on a server that hadn't been audited in 18 months, scores sat beside the names of soldiers who had never earned them. And one woman who had spent the morning watching the wind and the timing displays and the faces of men who never expected to be watched knew exactly where to look for them. She stood at the back of the next formation and opened her notebook to a fresh page. And she waited. Torres didn't sleep well that night. He lay on his bunk in the senior NCO quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about 7/10 of a second. That was the gap. 7/10 between what the screen said and what the physical sensor confirmed. He'd written in the margin of his stage sheet and then stared at it for the rest of the afternoon while the evaluation continued around him. And the more he stared at it, the less it felt like a calibration offset, and the more it felt like something else entirely. He got up at 5:30, dressed in the dark, and walked to the range office before anyone else arrived. The server room was locked. That was normal. What was not normal was that the access log on the door panel showed an entry at 2:17 in the morning under Captain Blake's authorization code. Torres stood in front of that panel for a long time. Then he walked to the coffee station, poured himself a cup, and waited. Claire arrived at 6:10. She came through the side entrance, carrying her notebook and a second cup of coffee. And when she saw Torres standing by the server room door, she didn't look surprised. She looked at the access panel, then at him, and she said, "What time?" 2:17, he said. She nodded slowly. "That's the second time this week." Torres felt the floor of the situation shift slightly beneath him. "You've been tracking the door logs." "I've been tracking a lot of things," she said. She handed him the second cup of coffee as if they had arranged this meeting days ago. "How long have you been here?" "Long enough," and he said, "I want to know what's actually happening." She looked at him for a moment with the measuring expression of someone deciding not how much to say, but in what order to say it. Then she said, 3 soldiers from this base were deployed to a joint rescue exercise 6 weeks ago. A helicopter evacuation in mountain terrain coordinated with civilian emergency services. All 3 of them failed to perform. Not partially, completely. "I heard about the exercise," Torres said. "The official report said equipment difficulties." "The equipment worked fine," Claire said. "The soldiers froze. They had never operated in conditions anywhere close to what their qualification records said they had trained for. A helicopter was delayed 40 minutes. 2 civilian responders were injured in a vehicle rollover because the overwatch position wasn't held." Torres set his coffee down. "And their records?" "Said they were ready," she said. "Said they had completed every qualification stage at this range under standard evaluation conditions. Said they were exactly the kind of people you deploy into that kind of situation." She paused. "Their records were wrong." Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How wrong? Wrong enough that someone had to make them wrong on purpose," she said. The word purpose sat between them in the empty corridor like something heavy that had been set down and wasn't going to be easy to pick back up. "Blake," Torres said. It wasn't a question. "I don't have enough to confirm that yet," Claire said. "That's what the evaluation is for." Torres looked at the server room door one more time. "You're not here to find the best shooter. I'm here to find out whether this range is producing what it says it's producing," she said. "The evaluation is real, the competition is real. But I need to see how the system behaves under observation, and I need to see what it does when someone starts looking at it carefully. And what has it done?" She opened her notebook to a page near the middle. She showed it to him, and Torres looked at a column of numbers and timestamps that meant nothing to him individually and everything to him collectively. The timing gaps, the calibration dates, a note about a scoring entry modified at 11:47 p.m. 3 weeks ago. Another entry changed at 1 a.m. the following Tuesday. "Those are Blake's hours," Torres said. "Yes," she said, "they are." Torres straightened up. He was a large man, and when he straightened to his full height, there was something in the movement that was less about posture and more about decision. "What do you need from me?" "Watch the display during today's stages," she said. "Don't let anyone know you're watching it specifically. And if Blake approaches you and asks questions about me, I need to know what he asks." "You think he's already suspicious?" "I think he was suspicious the moment I asked about the maintenance record on that rifle yesterday," she said. "A loose optic mount is a small thing. But the way I asked the question wasn't small, and Blake is smart enough to recognize the difference." She was right. She was right about all of it. And 2 floors above them, in a corner office, with a view of the range that Blake had occupied for 3 years, Captain Aaron Blake was awake and sitting at his desk and running through the same sequence of events she had just described, but from the other direction. He had watched her yesterday. He had watched the rifle to mount the shot. He had watched the timing stage and the way she'd stop before the third target, and he had watched her notebook, and he had watched Torres watching the display. And he had gone into the server room at 2:17 in the morning, not to change anything new, but to make sure the changes he had already made were deep enough in the system architecture that a casual review would never surface them. He believed they were. He also believed the woman with the notebook was not doing a casual review. Blake was not a careless man. He had not started falsifying records because he was lazy or greedy or stupid. He had started because the training program had been given a readiness quota that was impossible to meet honestly, and the alternative to meeting it was losing the funding that kept the range operational, which meant losing the instructors, which meant losing the program entirely. He had told himself he was protecting something worth protecting. He had told himself the soldiers would catch up. He had told himself the gap between their records and their actual ability was temporary, a bridge across a funding problem, something that would close on its own once resources stabilized. I had told himself that for 18 months. And then 6 weeks ago, 3 of his soldiers froze in a mountain helicopter exercise, and 2 people got hurt, and a gap that was supposed to close on its own revealed itself to be a cliff. Blake sat at his desk and thought about Major Claire Bennett, whose name he had found in the support personnel log that morning after running a search he should have run the day before. He found her name attached to a unit designation he recognized immediately because it was the kind of unit designation that certain captains learned to recognize, the way sailors learn to recognize particular cloud formations, not because anyone told them to, but because recognizing it early was the difference between navigating and sinking. Training Integrity Office, Senior Field Evaluator. He sat with that for a long time. Then he opened the final exercise schedule on his screen and began making changes. The morning's evaluation was already underway when Blake came down to the range. He arrived 20 minutes into the first stage, which was unusual. He was typically present from the start, and Torres noticed his arrival the same way Torres noticed most things, which was without appearing to notice at all. The stage was a target identification drill in degraded conditions. Fog machines and rain sprinklers had been deployed across the mid-range corridor, and the candidates had to distinguish between a set of threat profiles and a set of protected personnel profiles that were mixed into the target sequence at randomized intervals. It was in theory the closest thing to realistic field conditions that a range evaluation could produce. In practice, it was also the stage where the electronic scoring system's advantages were most significant because in poor visibility, the display's identification tags were clearer than direct observation. Dawson worked through the sequence with the confident efficiency of someone who had practiced this exact drill many times. He identified threats, correctly held fire on protected targets, and his time was fast enough to put him at the top of the current standings by a margin that was starting to feel decisive. Claire was 3 positions down. She worked more slowly. Not because her observation was worse, but because she was doing 2 things simultaneously, running the drill and reading the system display with the particular attention of someone who was looking for the moment when what the display said and what she could see did not match. She found it on the 7th target. The display tagged the 7th target as a protected civilian. What Claire could see through the degraded visibility was a figure in a gray jacket moving left to right at 410 yards. The jacket had a reflective band on the left sleeve. The figure was carrying something over the right shoulder. The display said civilian. Her eyes said the movement pattern was not matching the civilian profile parameters she had memorized before the stage began. She didn't fire. She also didn't report it. She wrote something in her notebook between the 7th and 8th targets, hit the next 2 threats cleanly, and finished the stage with a score that landed her in the middle of the field. Rourke walked the line after the stage completed. "Bennett," he said, stopping in front of her, "you skipped the 7th target." "I held fire on it," she said. "The system tagged it as a protected civilian. You should have moved past it and engaged the next threat." The movement pattern on the 7th target was inconsistent with the civilian profile parameters, she said. "I needed more time to confirm before I committed to treating it as a non-threat." Rourke frowned. "The system makes that classification for you." "The system made a classification," she said, I wasn't certain it was the right one. That kind of hesitation in the field. In the field, she said, the cost of shooting the wrong person is permanent. The cost of taking 2 extra seconds is recoverable. She paused. Sergeant Major, I'd like to ask you to pull the footage on the 7th target after this stage. I'd like to see what that figure was actually doing. Rourke looked at her with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that every conversation with this woman is going to land somewhere he didn't expect. He turned to the range assistant. Pull the 7th target footage. They pulled it. The 7th target had been a test figure, a range assistant in a gray jacket who had been assigned to walk through the target corridor at a randomized time wearing a civilian marker. What the footage showed was that the assistant had been walking the wrong direction. He had entered the corridor from the wrong end, which reversed the expected movement pattern, which was why Claire's observation hadn't matched the civilian profile. The system had tagged him correctly as a civilian because his marker was active. But if his marker had malfunctioned, he would have looked exactly like a threat. The system got it right, Rourke said. This time, Claire said, but the margin was the marker. If that marker fails, the system tags him based on movement pattern, and his movement pattern looked hostile. Rourke was quiet. I'm not saying the system is wrong, she said. I'm saying that trusting it completely without question, without independent verification, is a different kind of problem than having a bad system. She said it quietly without any inner voice. She said it the way you say something you have thought about for a long time and have finally found the right moment to put into words. Rourke walked away without answering. But Torres, standing 12 feet to his left, watched Rourke's face as he walked, and what he saw there was not dismissal. It was the look of a man beginning to recalculate. The mid-morning break came and soldiers scattered to the water station and the portable canopies at the range's edge. Dawson found Claire standing alone near the ammunition supply point, and he walked over to her with the deliberate casualness of someone who has decided to have a conversation they aren't entirely sure they want to have. You held fire on the 7th target, he said. Yes, she said. I didn't. She looked at him. I know. Dawson was quiet for a moment. He had a water bottle in his hand and he turned it slowly, something to do with his fingers while his brain worked. The system said civilian. It did, she said, so I was right to move past it. You were consistent with the evaluation parameters, she said carefully. Dawson recognized the distinction. She was not telling him he had been wrong. She was telling him the parameters themselves might not be sufficient. He stood with that for a moment, turning the water bottle, and then he said something that surprised her. When I was a private, he said, my first sergeant used to say that the most dangerous soldier on any range is the one who is too confident to be confused. He paused. I thought he was talking about people who panicked. I'm starting to think he meant something different. What do you think he meant? She asked. I think he meant people like me, Dawson said. He said it without self-pity, which made it land harder than it would have if he'd said it any other way. People who are good enough that being wrong feels impossible. He walked away before she could respond. And Claire watched him go and thought that Luke Dawson was a significantly more complicated person than anyone in that range had given him credit for, including herself. The afternoon stages were harder. Rourke had designed the second half of the evaluation to test the candidates under conditions where physical ability alone could not determine the outcome. The scenarios required coordination, judgment, and the willingness to make a decision with incomplete information, which was, as Rourke had always believed, the closest thing to actual combat that a range could produce. What Rourke did not know was that Blake had accessed the exercise schedule that morning and altered 2 of the parameters. He had extended the time window for the final approach stage and deactivated the backup safety communication channel, citing a system update that he had personally filed the paperwork for and personally approved. He had done it quietly, efficiently, with the practiced confidence of a man who had been making small adjustments to official systems for long enough that the adjustments no longer felt like violations. He told himself it would create enough technical confusion to cast doubt on any electronic evidence Claire might have gathered. He told himself the evaluation would continue safely. He told himself it was a defensive measure, not an escalation. He was wrong about that last part. Torres was 2 minutes into the 3rd afternoon stage when he noticed the backup channel was down. He checked his radio, switched to the secondary frequency, heard nothing switch back, and then walked calmly to the nearest range assistant. Is the backup safety channel operational? He asked. The assistant checked. It shows a scheduled update, Master Sergeant. Should be back online in time. He checked the notation approximately 4 hours. Who scheduled the update? The assistant looked at the log. Captain Blake this morning. Torres looked at the range. Stage was underway. 20 soldiers moving through a simulated field environment with a primary communication channel that was functioning normally and a backup that was not. It was not an emergency. It was the kind of thing that happened occasionally and was managed without incident. It was also exactly the kind of thing you would do if you wanted to ensure that a certain kind of emergency could not be quickly reported to anyone outside the range. Torres walked to the edge of the stage area and found Claire between shooting positions. Blake took down the backup channel, he said quietly, this morning. Her expression didn't change, but her hand moved to her notebook and she wrote something without looking down, which told Torres she had already been considering this possibility. Does Rourke know? She asked. Not yet. Don't tell him yet, she said. I need to know if Blake adjusts anything else before the final stage. Torres looked at her. What are you expecting him to do? I'm expecting him to realize that his best option at this point is to create enough confusion that any evidence I've gathered looks circumstantial, she said. The backup channel going down means anything that happens on this range in the next 4 hours can only be reported through the primary system which he controls. And the primary system has already shown me what it does when he controls it, she said. Torres felt the thing in his chest that he recognized as the sensation of a situation becoming genuinely serious. He had been in difficult situations before. He had been in dangerous ones. But this one had a particular quality that he couldn't fully articulate, which was the quality of a danger that had been present for a long time and was only now becoming visible. What do you need, he said. Keep watching, she said, and stay close to Rourke during the final stage. Why Rourke? Because when this breaks open, she said, the decision that matters most is going to be his. She was already moving back toward the stage. Torres stood in the afternoon light and thought about that. He thought about Rourke, 29 years in uniform, a man who had built his professional identity around two things: absolute confidence in his soldiers and absolute confidence in the systems those soldiers used. He thought about what it was going to mean for a man like that to learn that one of those things had been deliberately corrupted. Then he went back to watching. Dawson finished the third afternoon stage with the highest score of the day. He was clean controlled and consistently excellent, and the soldiers around him knew it and responded to it, the way soldiers respond to undeniable performance with respect that is independent of personal feeling. Even the ones who had privately hoped he would stumble acknowledged what they were watching. But something had shifted in Dawson himself. Rourke noticed it first. He watched Dawson between stages with the particular attention he gave to his best candidates, and what he saw was a man who was shooting perfectly and thinking visibly, which in Rourke's experience was not always the same thing as shooting with confidence. Dawson was fast. His trigger discipline was immaculate. But twice between engagements, he paused in a way that wasn't hesitation. Exactly, it was more like verification, like a man who was checking his own certainty before committing to it. Rourke found himself thinking about a conversation he had had with Claire that morning, which he had dismissed at the time and which refused to stay dismissed. The cost of shooting the wrong person is permanent. The cost of taking 2 extra seconds is recoverable. He hadn't agreed with it. He still wasn't sure he agreed with it. But the 7th target footage was playing in the back of his mind on a loop he couldn't stop. Blake approached him between the 4th and 5th afternoon stages. How is she performing? Blake asked. He said she with a studied casualness that was slightly too studied to be casual. She's in the middle of the field, Rourke said. Dawson's clearly the front runner. Dawson is exceptional, Rourke agreed. Bennett seems like more of an observer than a competitor, Blake said. I've been watching her. She spends a lot of time between shots looking at things that aren't targets. Rourke looked at him. She identified a loose optic mount that your range assistants missed, Aaron, and she held fire on a target with an inconsistent movement pattern that everyone else treated as confirmed. Blake's expression remained neutral. She's costing herself points. She's making decisions, Rourke said. Whether they're the right ones is the question. Blake shifted slightly. The final exercise schedule has been updated, by the way. I extended the approach window on the Mountain Village scenario and adjusted the target activation sequence. I wanted to give the candidates more time to develop their positions before the first contacts. When did you make those changes? Rourke asked. This morning, Blake said. I filed the update through the system. Rourke nodded. He had no reason to question it. Blake had been modifying exercise parameters for 3 years, always within his authority, always with appropriate paperwork. There was nothing in the statement that should have made Rourke's neck feel the way it felt right now, which was the way it felt when something was slightly wrong that he couldn't yet name. All right, he said. Blake walked away. Torres materialized at Rourke's shoulder 30 seconds later, which Rourke had come to recognize as Torres' particular skill. Did he tell you about the backup channel? Torres asked. He told me about the exercise update, Rourke said. What backup channel? Torres told him, quietly, specifically, without editorial. The way Torres delivered information he knew was going to require Rourke to do something with it. The backup channel, the access time, Blake's authorization code at 2:17 in the morning. Rourke listened to all of it without speaking. Then he said very quietly, You've been watching her work. I have, Torres said. You think she's more than evaluation support. I think, Torres said carefully, that she knows things about this range that she didn't learn by standing at the back of the formation. Rourke turned and looked at the range at the candidates moving through the final preparation for the last afternoon stage at Blake. Standing near the observation deck with his coffee and his careful expression at Claire, near the ammunition point with her notebook open to a fresh page. What do you think is actually happening here, Raymond? He asked. It was one of the only times in 20 years he had used Torres's first name outside of formal debrief. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think the wrong people got the right scores, Sergeant Major, and I think somebody made that happen, and I think we're about to find out how far it goes. Rourke was still looking at the range. The candidates were taking their positions for the 5th stage. The electronic display was cycling through its pre-stage initialization. The afternoon sun was moving behind the western ridge. In approximately 16 hours, the final exercise would begin in the mountain training village, and 12 positions would be filled, and the evaluation would officially conclude. I thought about 3 soldiers in a helicopter exercise 6 weeks ago. He thought about a delayed evacuation and 2 injured responders and a gap between what records said and what people could actually do. He thought about the woman at the back of the formation who had looked at the wind before she looked at the target. Get me the original exercise schedule, he said, the one before Blake's update this morning. I already have it, Torres said. Rourke looked at him. I pulled it an hour ago, Torres said simply, before I came to find you. Rourke took the folded paper Torres handed him and looked at the changes Blake had made. The extended approach window, the adjusted target sequence, the backup channel update, individually each one was defensible. Taken together at 2 in the morning, after a day when a woman with a notebook had exposed a loose optic mount and questioned a classified display and held a fire on a target that nobody else had questioned, they were something different. They were preparation. Blake was preparing for something to go wrong, and he was positioning himself so that when it did, the failure would land somewhere other than his desk. Rourke folded the paper. He held it for a moment. Then he did something that Thomas Rourke had not done voluntarily in 11 years of running this range. He walked across the gravel to where Claire Bennett was standing with her notebook, and he stopped in front of her, and he said without preamble, without pride in his voice, I need to know what you know. She looked up at him. He held her gaze without flinching. And I need you to tell me all of it. She closed the notebook. She looked at him for a moment with the measuring expression he was beginning to recognize, the one that calculated not honesty, because she had already decided to be honest but readiness. Whether he was ready to hear it. Then she said, Find us somewhere private, Sergeant Major. This is going to take a few minutes. And what came next changed everything Thomas Rourke believed he knew about the range he had commanded for 11 years. Rourke found a room. It was the range supervisor's office at the back of the main building, a small space with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a window that faced the interior wall rather than the range. Nobody came here during active evaluation hours. Rourke closed the door and turned around and looked at Claire Bennett and said nothing. Because sometimes silence is the most efficient way to tell someone that you are ready. She didn't waste his time. 18 months, she said. That's how long the scoring irregularities go back. The earliest altered entry we have confirmed is from a night qualification cycle in March of last year. The change was made at 11:52 p.m. under Blake's code. It adjusted a failing score to a conditional pass. She opened her notebook to the middle section and turned it toward him. There are 23 entries we've flagged so far. 14 of them moved failing scores to passing. 6 of them inflated passing scores to exceptional. 3 of them erased remedial training flags entirely. Rourke looked at the numbers. He was a man who had spent 30 years understanding what numbers on a training record meant in practical terms, what they meant when someone deployed, when someone was trusted with a position, when someone's readiness level determined whether the person standing next to them came home. He looked at Claire's notebook and felt something move through his chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but shared a border with both of them. 3 soldiers, he said, the exercise 6 weeks ago. All 3 of them had altered records, she said. 2 of the changes were made within the same 48-hour window. The 3rd was modified 11 days before deployment. Rourke shone down. He did it slowly, the way a large man sits when the weight he is carrying is not physical. Aaron Blake has been on this range for 3 years. Yes. I've known him for 5. I know that, she said. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who understood the difference between information and what information costs. I'm not telling you he deceived you because you were careless, Sergeant Major. I'm telling you he deceived you because he was careful. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, the range was running the 5th afternoon stage. He could hear the distant sound of the PA system calling candidates to position. He could hear boots on gravel. He could hear the ordinary sounds of a place he had built and trusted and run for 11 years, and those sounds had a different quality now than they'd had 40 minutes ago. The backup channel, he said, he took it down this morning, she said, which means whatever he's planning for the final exercise, he wants to make sure it can only be reported through the primary system, the system he controls. What do you think he's planning? She was honest. I don't know exactly. I think he's trying to create enough technical confusion to make any evidence I've gathered look inconclusive. Scoring anomalies that could be blamed on equipment. Communication failures that could be attributed to terrain. She paused. What I'm more concerned about is that he made changes to the final exercise schedule this morning without telling you until after the fact. He adjusted the target activation sequence. Rourke felt it then. The cold, specific weight of a realization arriving. If the target sequence is wrong, the final exercise puts 20 candidates in a simulated village environment with electronic target management and mixed civilian and threat profiles, she said. If the target system feeds corrupted data during a high-pressure scenario, the candidates will be making lethal decisions based on information that isn't accurate. Rourke stood up, fast for a man of his size. We cancel the final exercise. If you cancel it now, Blake knows we know, she said. He destroys whatever he hasn't already destroyed, and we have notebook entries and timing discrepancies. Not enough. Rourke looked at her. Then what do you want me to do? Run the exercises, she said, but put me in it as secondary shooter behind Dawson. Let me watch the system from inside the scenario. If Blake has altered the target sequence, I'll see it in real time. And I have a secure emergency channel on my person that doesn't route through the range's primary system. She met his eyes. If it goes wrong, I can reach the investigators directly. They're already 40 minutes out. They've been 40 minutes out since yesterday morning. Rourke stared at her. You already called investigators. I called them when I confirmed the first altered entry, she said. 2 days before I stepped onto this range. He sat back down. He pressed both hands flat on the metal desk and looked at them for a moment. You came here knowing. I came here to confirm what I already suspected, she said. The evaluation gave me the environment to do that. Every stage we ran today gave me another piece. She paused. Sergeant Major, I know this is not what you wanted to hear in this room. I know what this range means to you. I know what it means that this happened here and not somewhere you'd already written off. But the people who were hurt 6 weeks ago were hurt because the gap between what the record said and what the soldiers could do was never made visible. I am here to make it visible. Rourke was quiet for a long time. Then he said, What do you need from me for the final exercise? She told him. The briefing for the final stage happened at dusk. Rourke stood in front of the full candidate group and outlined the mountain village scenario with the measured authority of a man who had run this exercise before and was not visibly troubled. He told them the parameters. He told them the rules of engagement. He told them that Dawson would command the primary shooting position and that Bennett would function as his secondary, which produced a visible reaction from Dawson, not protest, but the careful stillness of someone absorbing a decision that lands differently than expected. Dawson found Claire afterward. Secondary, he said. Yes, she said. You're better than secondary. That's a kind thing to say. It's not kindness, he said. It's accurate, and you know it. She looked at him steadily. Luke, what I need from the final stage is not a score. I need to be in a position where I can see both the target system display and your decision-making at the same time. She paused. Can you trust me to be useful from secondary? Dawson looked at her for a moment. He was a man who had built an entire professional identity around being first, around being the name that went in the top line of every evaluation result. Being told that someone better than him was choosing to stand behind him was not something he had a ready emotional category for. It required a kind of recalibration that didn't happen in seconds, but he said yes, and he meant it. Torres appeared at Rourke's shoulder in the darkness before the exercise began. Blake is on the observation deck, Torres said. He has been since the briefing ended. Watching it, Rourke said, watching, and he has his radio. He's been on it twice in the last 20 minutes. Rourke looked at the observation deck. Blake was a shape against the last light, a man with a coffee cup and a radio, in the posture of someone who believes they are in control of what is about to happen. Rourke had known men like that his entire career. He had sometimes been men like that. The posture of control was one of the most reliable things in the military and one of the most dangerous because it was indistinguishable from actual control until the moment it wasn't. Stay close to me, Rourke said. Already planned on it, Torres said. The exercise began. The mountain village scenario was a large training environment with fixed structures, mechanical target systems of vehicle route for the simulated medical convoy, and a network of electronic sensors that fed information to the shooter's displays in real time. The candidates moved into position with the focused energy of people who had been competing all day and had saved something for this final stage. The way runners save something for the last half mile, not because they plan to, but because the body knows when the end is close and responds to it. Dawson established his primary position on an elevated firing platform that gave him a clean sight line across the main approach corridor. Claire settled in 6 feet to his right and slightly behind which was secondary position by both definition and design. And she opened her display and looked at it, and then looked at the village, and then back at the display. And what she was doing was the thing she had been doing all day, reading the gap between what the machine said and what her eyes confirmed. The convoy entered the approach road. The first 3 contacts were clean. Mechanical targets representing hostile profiles activated at expected intervals. Dawson engaged them with the precise efficiency that had put him at the top of the scoring in all day, and the secondary display confirmed hits accurately and immediately. Torres positioned below the platform with Rourke watched the display timing and saw nothing anomalous. Then the 4th contact activated. The display tagged it immediately. Hostile profile 800 meters elevated position on the north structure. Dawson's eyes came up. He found the figure. He began settling into his firing position. Claire looked at the display, then she looked at the figure. She looked at the reflective band on the left arm. She looked at the radio antenna extending from the figure's right shoulder. She looked at the movement, not advancing, not withdrawing, but the specific lateral movement of a person looking for a landmark. She said it quietly and without hesitation. Don't take that shot. Dawson heard it. His finger was outside the trigger guard. He was not a man who put his finger on the trigger before he was ready to fire. But his whole body was oriented toward the target. His optic was up. His breathing had already shifted into the shallow, controlled rhythm of a shooter about to engage. He stopped. System shows hostile, he said. It was not defiance. It was a man stating the information he had so that the person questioning it could respond to the specific thing he was working with. I see that, Claire said. Look at the reflective band on the left arm. Look at the antenna. Look at the movement pattern. Dawson looked. He looked with the genuine attention of a man who has already decided to trust the person next to him and is now applying that trust to what his eyes are doing. He looked at the band. He looked at the antenna. He looked at the way the figure moved laterally with the particular body language of someone who has arrived in the wrong place and is trying to determine where they should be. That's a safety controller, he said. I think so, she said. The system says hostile. The system is wrong. Above them on the observation deck, Blake's radio went to his face. The next 40 seconds were the kind of 40 seconds that people remember with a quality of detail that ordinary time doesn't produce. Rourke heard Blake's radio transmission, not the words, but the fact of it, the timing, and he felt the thing in his neck that he'd felt all afternoon sharpen into something specific. He turned to Torres. Torres was already moving. The display on Dawson's screen flickered. Then it changed. The hostile tag on the distant figure disappeared and was replaced by a civilian marker. But that was not the only change. 3 other targets activated simultaneously in sectors that were not supposed to go active for another 6 minutes, and the convoy vehicle on the approach road suddenly accelerated without instruction. And from somewhere down the service road on the north side came the sound of a vehicle losing traction on a steep grade. The exercise had just become something other than an exercise. Rourke's voice came over the primary channel. All candidates hold current positions. We have a potential live situation on the North Service Road. Blake's voice came over the same channel 15 seconds later. Rourke, this is a system malfunction. Keep the exercise running. I'm managing the issue from the deck. Rourke looked at the observation deck. He looked at Torres. He looked at the range around him, candidates frozen in their positions. The convoy vehicle stopped at the wrong point in the approach road. The North Service Road, hidden behind the main structure, where the sound of the vehicle was getting worse. Bennett, he said into his radio, what do you have? Her voice came back immediately. 3 automated targets active in sectors 5, 7, and 9. That is not the modified schedule. That is not any schedule. The system is feeding incorrect activation data. A pause. The convoy vehicle stopped itself. The driver's safety override activated. Someone is on the North Service Road in a vehicle that is not responding to brakes on a grade. Can you confirm the North Road situation? Negative visual from my position, she said. I need Torres on the north side. Rourke looked at Torres. Torres was already gone. Blake's voice again on the primary channel. And this time the careful neutrality in it had cracked at the edges in a way that Rourke had never heard from him in 5 years. Sergeant Major, stand down. This is a controlled system test. I have the scenario parameters adjusted for an advanced training objective. Keep your candidates in position. Aaron, Rourke said, tell me where the safety controller is. Silence. Aaron, the figure at 800 meters on the north structure. Where is the safety controller assigned to that position? More silence. And in that silence, Rourke felt the last structure of his uncertainty about Blake collapse. Not dramatically, not with any of the noise that dramatic collapses make in stories, but quietly the way a wall that has been undermined for a long time finally gives way when the last support fails. Torres, Rourke called. Torres's voice came back, and it was the voice of a man who is calm because the situation requires it and not because the situation deserves it. Sergeant Major, vehicle on the North Service Road, unmanned maintenance cart. The release mechanism failed and it's running down slope. There are 2 range assistants in the lower work area. Time 90 seconds, maybe less. On the platform, Claire Bennett was already calculating. She had run the geometry the moment Torres confirmed the cart. She knew the angle from her position. She knew the distance to the release mechanism on the cart, the brake housing on the rear axle, a specific metal component that if destroyed correctly would drop the cart's rear wheels into a locking position and stop it cold. It was not a miraculous shot. It was a precise one. It required hitting a target approximately the size of a human fist at 430 meters on a moving target going downhill. She looked at Dawson. I need the primary position. He stepped aside without a word. She settled in. She did the thing she always did. She stopped. She read the movement. She calculated the speed and the angle and the wind and the grade, but she did all of it in about 4 seconds instead of 30 because 90 seconds was not 30 seconds. And the 2 assistants in the lower work area people and not scoring targets. She fired once. The cart's rear axle locked. The vehicle slewed sideways on the grade and stopped against the embankment with the particular abrupt finality of a thing that has been prevented from becoming something much worse. The range went completely silent. Torres's voice came back. Cart is stopped. Assistants are clear. Rourke exhaled. And then, before anyone had fully processed what had just happened, Claire lowered her rifle and stepped off the platform and ran. Not toward the scoring position, not toward the observation deck. She ran toward the North Service Road, toward the two assistants she had never met, who had been standing 40 feet from a runaway vehicle 30 seconds ago. And the running was not dramatic, it was functional. It was the movement of someone whose priority had already shifted from the shot to the people. The shot was meant to protect. Dawson watched her go. He stood on the platform with his rifle at low ready and watched her disappear around the north structure. And he felt something shift inside himself that had no military name and didn't need one. Blake came off the observation deck. He came down fast, which was the first time Rourke had seen him move without his characteristic deliberateness, and the speed itself was information. He came across the gravel toward Rourke with the expression of a man who has spent 18 months building a structure and has just watched someone pull the central support out from under it. The system malfunctioned, Blake said. It happens. This was within parameters. The safety controller on the north structure, Rourke said. Who was he? A range assistant assigned to the civilian marker role. Who put him in Sector 9 instead of Sector 6? Blake stopped. The question was specific, and the specificity of it told him something about how much Rourke already knew. And the expression on his face changed in a way that was not large, but was completely legible to a man who had known him for 5 years. The target sequence was adjusted this morning, Blake said. I documented the change. You documented a change, Rourke said. You didn't tell me there was a safety controller whose position had been moved to a sector the scoring system was going to flag as hostile. It was an advanced training parameter. It was a man who almost got shot, Rourke said. The word shot landed between them with the weight that it deserved. Torres came around the north corner of the structure and walked toward them with the unhurried pace of a man carrying information he knows is heavy. Behind him, 40 meters back, Claire was talking to the two range assistants. She had one hand on the arm of the closer one, a young specialist who looked like he had not yet fully processed that the sound he'd heard on the service road had been a rifle and not additional mechanical failure. She was talking to him quietly, which was the right thing and which she did without being asked. Sergeant Major, Torres said, stopping beside Rourke. The release mechanism on that cart had been manually bypassed. Rourke looked at him. Manually bypassed. The safety pin was removed from the rear brake housing. Whoever deployed the cart for range support this morning had to manually remove a physical pin to make that happen. Rourke turned back to Blake. Blake said nothing, and the silence he gave them was the loudest thing that had happened on that range all day. Claire came back across the range with her notebook in her hand. She stopped beside Rourke and looked at Blake with the expression of someone who has prepared for this specific moment and feels no satisfaction about its arrival. She reached into her jacket and produced a satellite communicator. Small flat, the kind of device that looks like a modified GPS unit, and pressed a single button. This is Bennett. Exercise concluded. Requesting immediate response. Authorization Lima 7 actual. She released the button. Blake looked at the device, then at her. Who are you? She met his eyes. I'm the person who was standing quietly at the back of the formation this morning. She paused. You should have paid more attention to what I was doing instead of trying to figure out why I was there. You don't have the authority to Major Claire Bennett, she said, Senior Field Evaluator, Army Training Integrity Office. I have been conducting an authorized investigation into scoring irregularities at this installation for 17 days. I have documentation of 23 altered qualification records, a server access log showing unauthorized after-hours entries, a physical maintenance record showing a bypass brake mechanism on the vehicle that just ran downslope, and a backup channel deactivation order filed this morning under your code. She closed her notebook. I have enough. Blake looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back at him. And the thing on Rourke's face in that moment was not anger exactly. It was the specific expression of a man who has been betrayed by something he loved, which is different from the expression of a man who has been surprised by something he never trusted. Aaron, Rourke said. Why, one way. Blake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the careful neutrality he'd maintained all day. It had become, for the first time, honest. The quota was impossible, he said. You know what the readiness numbers required. You know what the funding cycle looked like. If I had let the actual scores stand, we would have lost 8 instructor positions in the advanced range certification. The program would have been gutted. So you changed the scores. I bought time, Blake said. I told myself the soldiers would catch up. I told myself a temporary adjustment was better than a permanent program closure. 3 of your soldiers froze in a helicopter exercise, Claire said quietly. 2 people were injured. I know that, Blake said, and his voice cracked on it. Finally, the way things crack when the weight that's been on them has been there long enough. I know what happened. I know what I caused. I told myself it was for the institution. You changed what commanders believed people could survive, Claire said. That's not protecting the institution. That's hollowing it out and leaving the shell. Blake didn't answer. There was nothing to answer with. 40 minutes later, the investigators arrived. They came in 2 vehicles moving fast up the access road with the particular efficiency of people who have been 40 minutes away for 2 days and are finally closing the distance. They were 4 people, 2 from the Training Integrity Office and 2 from the Criminal Investigation Division, and they moved through the range with the practiced speed of people who knew exactly what they were looking for because they had been briefed on exactly where to find it. Rourke stood at the edge of the range and watched them work. Torres stood beside him and said nothing, which was the most useful thing Torres could have done. Dawson came and stood on Rourke's other side. He was still carrying his rifle at low ready out of habit, and after a moment he engaged the safety and slung it because holding it no longer felt right. He looked at the investigators and then at Blake, who was sitting on a folding chair outside the range office with the particular stillness of a man whose decisions have finally caught up with his posture. He really believed he was protecting something, Dawson said. It was not a defense. It was an observation. Yes, Rourke said, that's the worst part of it. Rourke looked at him. Dawson was 20 years younger than he was and had understood something in 30 seconds that had taken Rourke the entire day. Why is that the worst part? Because it means he wasn't a monster, Dawson said. It means he was just wrong in a way that any of us could be wrong. That's harder to protect against. Rourke thought about that for a long time. He thought about confidence in institutions and the stories people tell themselves when the gap between what they want to be true and what is true becomes too wide to cross, honestly. I thought about how many times he had seen impressive numbers and not asked whether the numbers were real. He thought about Claire standing at the back of the formation with her notebook watching the wind, and he thought about the fact that he had almost sent her away before she'd fired a single shot. Claire came and stood beside Torres. She had her notebook closed and her satellite communicator put away, and without those things, she looked for the first time that day, like someone who had finished what she had come to do and was allowing herself to be simply a person for a moment. The safety controller is fine, she said. Both assistants are fine. The cart damage is superficial. And the evaluation, Rourke asked. The evaluation results stand, she said. The stages were real. The performance was real. Dawson is genuinely exceptional. She paused. So are several others on the candidate list? Rourke nodded. He looked at the range at the targets, still standing in their positions. At the convoy vehicle stopped on the approach road at the lights the investigators had set up outside the server room, where Blake's 18 months of careful wrongness was being carefully unwound. He looked at Claire. You could have told me on the first day, he said. No, she said. I couldn't. Because on the first day, you would have defended everything you'd built. You would have made it impossible to find what I needed to find. She met his eyes. I needed you to see it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I mocked you in front of 40 soldiers. You did, she said, and you stayed. I stayed, she said, because the work mattered more than the insult. Rourke looked at her for a long time. Then he looked away at the range. He stood straight, the way a man stands when he has decided to carry something properly instead of pretending it isn't heavy. What happens now, he asked. Now, she said, we find out which of those 23 names need honest reevaluation, and we give it to them without shame. And then we build something here that tells the truth. The investigators were still working. The stars were beginning to show above the western ridge. And the range was quiet in the particular way that places are quiet after something significant has happened inside them. Not empty, but full of what had just occurred, the way a room is full after an important conversation, even after the people have gone. Dawson looked up at the stars. Torres checked his watch. Rourke pressed his hands into his pockets and stood at the edge of everything he had built and thought about what it meant to build something honestly. And Claire Bennett stood beside all of them and said nothing, because sometimes the most important moment is not the shot and not the revelation, but the silence that follows them, The silence in which the people who need to change begin quietly and without fanfare to change. The investigators worked through the night. Rourke didn't sleep. He sat in the range supervisor's office, the same small room where Claire had laid out everything she knew 12 hours earlier. And he read through the printed documentation the investigators had pulled from the server. Page after page of altered timestamps, modified scores, and authorization codes entered in the hours when the building was supposed to be empty. He read all of it without rushing, because rushing would have been a way of not fully absorbing what he was reading, and Thomas Rourke had decided sometime around midnight that he was not going to protect himself from the full weight of what had happened on his range. When he had commanded this installation for 11 years, he had run 7 major evaluations. He had sent soldiers to joint exercises and real deployments with the absolute confidence that what their records said about them was true. That confidence had not been arrogance exactly. It had been institutional trust, the belief that the system he was part of was producing honest results because the people he trusted were producing honest results. He had been wrong about one of those people. And the question that kept him awake, the one that had nothing to do with Blake and everything to do with himself, was whether he had created conditions that made it easier for Blake to do what he did. Whether the culture he had built on this range, the culture of visible confidence and impressive numbers, and the kind of command presence that rewarded people who looked like winners, had made it harder for anyone to raise a hand and say that something wasn't right. At 3 in the morning, he put the papers down and looked at the wall. At 3:15, Torres knocked on the open door. "You should sleep, Sergeant Major," Torres said. "I'm aware," Rourke said. Torres came in and sat in the second chair without being invited, which was the prerogative of a man who had served alongside someone long enough to know when formality was a form of avoidance. He looked at the papers on the desk. 23 entries, Torres said. 23 confirmed, Rourke said. The investigators think there may be more in the archived evaluation cycles. They're pulling records going back 30 months. Torres absorbed that. How many soldiers? 17 names so far, across 4 evaluation cycles. Torres was quiet for a moment. Most of them didn't know. No, Rourke said, they didn't. That matters. It matters, and it doesn't fix anything, Rourke said. They went to exercises and deployments carrying qualifications they hadn't actually earned. Whether they knew it or not, they were a liability to everyone around them. He paused. 2 people got hurt in that helicopter exercise, Raymond. 2 real people who were counting on Overwatch that wasn't what it said it was. Torres looked at him steadily. And Blake is accountable for that. Blake is accountable for that, Rourke agreed. And I am accountable for the environment that let it go unnoticed for 18 months. The statement sat between them without argument because Torres was not the kind of man who offered false comfort, and Rourke was not the kind of man who wanted it. What are you going to do? Torres asked. Rourke looked at the papers for a moment. Everything she said. Reevaluate every affected soldier without shame. Reform the verification system. Change the culture. He paused. Starting with the conversation I am going to have with 40 soldiers in about 5 hours. Torres nodded slowly. That's going to be hard. Yes, Rourke said, it is. He picked up the papers and stacked them evenly and set them at the edge of the desk. Go get some sleep, Raymond. I need you functional in the morning. What about you? I'll be functional, Rourke said. I'll just be tired while I am. Torres almost smiled. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and went to the door. Then he stopped. For what it's worth, Sergeant Major, the way you handled it tonight, pulling the original schedule, coming to her without your guard up, that was the right thing. Rourke looked at him. It was late. It was right, Torres said. Late and right is better than never. He left. Rourke sat alone in the small office with the stack of papers and the particular quality of silence that comes at 3 in the morning when a man is sitting with something true that he wishes were different. He did not sleep, but he was ready when the morning came. The formation happened at 7 a.m. All 40 candidates, plus the range staff, plus the 3 senior instructors who had been called in from the adjacent training facility when the investigators arrived the night before. They stood on the gravel in the early light with a particular tension of people who have heard pieces of something significant and are waiting to hear the rest of it. Rourke stood in front of them without a platform this time. He stood at ground level, which was a deliberate choice and one that several of the soldiers noticed. He told them everything. Not the legal details, those were the investigators' territory, but the operational reality. the altered scores, the helicopter exercise, the injured responders, the gap between what the record said and what the soldiers could actually do. He told them in the direct, precise language of a man who has decided that protecting his own reputation is less important than giving the people in front of him an honest account of what had happened in the institution they served. The formation was very still while he spoke. When he finished, he said, 17 soldiers in this command structure have qualification records that do not accurately reflect their training. Most of them did not know. All of them deserve an honest reassessment. He paused. There will be no punishment for the gap between what the record says and what a reevaluation shows. There will be honest instruction and honest support. That is what should have been provided from the beginning, and I am telling you now that it will be provided going forward. He let that settle for a moment. Then he said, I also want to say something about this evaluation, about what you witnessed over the past 2 days. He looked across the formation. I stood in front of you yesterday morning and I mocked an officer for standing quietly at the back and watching the wind. I told her that reading numbers didn't make someone a marksman. I used her silence against her before she'd been given a chance to demonstrate anything at all. He stopped. I was wrong. And I was wrong in a way that I have been wrong before on this range with other people, and I did not see it until yesterday. The formation was completely silent. Dawson, standing in the third row, looked at the gravel and felt the particular discomfort of someone hearing a confession that reflects their own behavior at a level they hadn't fully acknowledged. Rourke continued, the culture on this range has valued confidence, visible confidence, the kind that takes up space and announces itself. I built that culture deliberately because I believed it produced good soldiers, and it produces some good soldiers. He paused. It also produces soldiers who never learn to question a system when the system is wrong. It produces evaluators who accept impressive numbers because impressive numbers feel true. And it produces an environment where someone doing something quietly and carefully can be dismissed before they've proven anything. He looked at Claire. She was standing at the edge of the formation. She had not been placed in it. She was not technically a candidate, but she had come to stand near it because she understood that what Rourke was saying needed witnesses, and being a witness was something she took seriously. Major Bennett, Rourke said, I owe you an apology in front of the same people who laughed when I dismissed you. The formation was very still. Claire looked at him. She looked at him with the calm, level attention she had given everything on this range, the wind, the targets, the timing displays, and she said, I accept, Sergeant Major. She said it simply, without the satisfaction that some people would have brought to the moment, and without the false modesty that others would have performed. She accepted because it was offered honestly, and because accepting honestly was the right response to something offered honestly. Rourke nodded. Then he asked the question, who is the best marksman here? The formation was quiet, not the competitive quiet of the first morning, where the silence was just the pause before the hands went up. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when a room full of people is genuinely thinking instead of performing. No hands went up. Rourke looked across the formation. I asked that question 2 mornings ago, and I watched hands go up before I'd finished the sentence. I watched people announce their excellence before they'd demonstrated anything. He paused. Nobody is raising their hand now. I want to know why. A soldier in the second row, a young staff sergeant named Carver, who had placed 4th in the overall evaluation, said, because we're not sure anymore what the question is asking. Rourke looked at him. Say more. Carver thought about it. 2 days ago, I thought it was asking who was the best at hitting targets. Now I'm not sure it's a question about hitting anything. Rourke let that sit. Then he said, Staff Sergeant Dawson, in your assessment, who is the best marksman on this range? Dawson looked up from the gravel. He had been expecting the question the way you expect something that you know is coming, but haven't finished deciding how to answer. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm the best at hitting targets accurately at speed, Sergeant Major. I believe that honestly. But, Rourke said, Dawson was quiet again. But yesterday I almost fired at a safety controller because a screen told me he was hostile, and I was moving fast and confident and not asking the right questions. He paused. I didn't fire because someone next to me asked me to stop, and I trusted her enough to listen. He looked at Claire briefly, then back at Rourke. I'm not sure that makes me the best marksman. I think it makes me the best shooter. Those might not be the same thing. Rourke looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that crosses 20 years of evaluation results and competition scores, and the particular pride of watching someone exceptional do exceptional things and arrive somewhere more complicated and more true. No, Rourke said, they are not the same thing. He looked back at the formation. The best marksman, he said, is the one who understands the cost of every shot. He paused. Not the score of every shot. The cut. He let it stand. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The formation was dismissed. Soldiers moved in the particular way they move after something significant, not scattered, but quiet in small clusters. The way people move when they need to process something together without yet knowing how to articulate it. Dawson found Claire near the ammunition point. He stood beside her without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, I owe you something. You don't, she said. I spent 2 days feeling threatened by you, he said. I thought you were here to embarrass the range, to prove that what we do here doesn't matter. He paused. I was wrong about what you were doing, and I was wrong about why you were doing it. You hesitated yesterday, she said, when I told you not to take the shot. You could have ignored me. You had the score to spare the command authority and the system on your side. She looked at him. But you stopped. That wasn't the decision of a man who only cares about being first. Dawson was quiet. Then he said, it was the hardest thing I've done on this range. Harder than any shot. I know, she said. That's why it matters more than any shot. He stood with that for a moment. What happens to my score? The stages I beat you in, they stand. Every score stands, she said. The evaluation was real. You are genuinely exceptional, Luke. Nobody is taking that from you. She paused. What I hope is that what you learned here goes with you when you lead people, and that you create the kind of environment where the person standing quietly at the back isn't dismissed before they've had a chance to show you what they see. Dawson looked at her. Are you always this direct? I try to be, and she said, I find it saves time. He almost laughed. It was a real almost laugh, the kind that happens when something is genuinely funny inside a serious moment. Yeah, he said. I think I see that. I extended his hand. She shook it. It was a firm, uncomplicated handshake between two people who had spent 2 days being adversaries in every way, except the one that mattered, and who had come out the other side of something difficult with mutual respect that neither of them had expected. He walked away. And Claire stood for a moment alone in the morning light and allowed herself to feel briefly and without performance the particular satisfaction of a thing accomplished, not perfectly, not without cost, but honestly and completely. Then she went to find Blake. It was in a temporary interview room that the investigators had established in the range administration building at a conference room, repurposed for the morning with a table and chairs and 2 CID agents who had been with him since 6 a.m. Claire knocked on the door. One of the agents opened it. She asked for 5 minutes. The agent looked at his colleague and then stepped outside. Blake looked up when she came in. He looked like a man who had been sitting with the consequences of his decisions for approximately 9 hours and had not found any position in which those consequences were comfortable. He had always been a composed man, measured, deliberate, the kind of person who managed situations by managing himself first. That composure was gone. What was left was something more honest and considerably less polished. You don't have to be here, he said. I know, she said. She pulled a chair out and sat across from him. I want to understand something. He looked at her. What? When you changed the first score, she said. March of last year, the night qualification cycle. What did you tell yourself? Blake was quiet for a long moment. She had expected him to be defensive. He wasn't. He was something more difficult, which was genuine. I told myself it was one soldier, he said. A good soldier who had performed perfectly in every other stage and had a bad night. I told myself the system was too rigid. That one failed night score shouldn't eliminate someone who had demonstrated competence in every other context. That's not an unreasonable thought, she said. He looked at her slightly surprised. Evaluation systems have legitimate limitations, she said. The problem is what you did next. The next one was easier, he said. That's the thing nobody tells you. The first one cost you something. The second one costs less. By the 6th or 7th, you build a logic that makes the whole pattern feel like judgment instead of manipulation. He stopped. I told myself I knew these soldiers. I told myself I was a better judge of their readiness than a single score on a single night. And the quota, she said. The quota was real, he said, and his voice had a thread of the old defensiveness in it quickly controlled. The funding structure punished honest numbers. A program that produced realistic failure rates got cut. A program that produced high pass rates got resources. I was watching other ranges game the system and get rewarded for it while we lost positions for being accurate. So you gamed it too. I told myself I was leveling the field, and he said, and the 3 soldiers in the helicopter exercise, she said. When you heard what happened, what did you tell yourself then? The old composure came completely apart. He looked at the table for a moment, and she watched him work through something that was clearly not new. Not a fresh wound, but an old one that had been held closed by everything he'd told himself for 6 weeks. I told myself it wasn't my fault, he said. I told myself the exercise conditions were too extreme. I told myself the evaluation system should have caught their weaknesses in other stages. He looked up. And then I sat in my car in the parking structure for about 40 minutes, and I couldn't make myself believe any of it. She looked at him quietly. You didn't change numbers on a screen, she said. You changed what commanders believed people could survive. He flinched. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it was real. I know, he said. I'm not saying it to punish you, she said. I'm saying it because I need you to understand the specific thing that was wrong. Not the rule violation, the actual harm. She paused. The commanders who deployed those soldiers weren't reckless. They were relying on a system that was supposed to tell them the truth. You took that away from them, and you took it away from the soldiers themselves who deserved to know where their actual gaps were so they could close them. Blake was quiet for a long time. What happens to them, the 17 soldiers? Honest reevaluation, she said. Additional instruction, no public shame, no automatic career consequences for the gap itself. She paused. That was always available to them. It was always the honest path. You chose a different one. He nodded slowly. I know. She stood. She picked up her notebook and put it under her arm. She stood at the table for a moment looking at him, and the expression on her face was not forgiveness exactly and not judgment exactly. It was the expression of someone who had seen enough of human decision-making to understand how it went wrong without losing the belief that it was supposed to go right. For what it's worth, she said, I think you started doing this because you cared about the program. I think you convinced yourself it was temporary. I think you genuinely didn't see yourself as the person who was causing harm. She paused. That doesn't make what you did acceptable, but it makes it human, and human mistakes that are understood can become human lessons. She moved toward the door. The ones that aren't understood just repeat. She left him with that. The investigators worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Records were pulled, cross-referenced, documented. The 17 names were confirmed, then expanded to 19 when 2 additional altered entries surfaced in an archived evaluation cycle that the initial search hadn't reached. Blake cooperated fully, which the investigators noted in their documentation, with the particular clinical neutrality of people who are trained not to express opinions about cooperation. Rourke spent most of the day in meetings with the investigators, with the 3 senior instructors, with the base commander who had driven from the main facility, and who received Rourke's account of the previous 48 hours with the carefully managed expression of a senior officer being told something that he understands is going to require significant organizational response. The base commander was a general named Whitfield. He had known Rourke for 12 years. He sat across from Rourke in the range supervisor's office and listened to everything without interrupting, which in Rourke's experience was either a very good sign or a very bad one and was not always distinguishable from the outside. When Rourke finished, Whitfield said, You've recommended retaining all 19 soldiers pending honest reevaluation. Yes, sir, Rourke said. And you've recommended no administrative action against the soldiers themselves. The soldiers didn't falsify their own records, Rourke said. Punishing them for a gap they didn't create and weren't informed of would be both unjust and counterproductive. What they need is accurate assessment and honest training support. Whitfield looked at him for a moment. Some of them may not make it through honest reevaluation. Some of them may not, Rourke agreed. That's what honest evaluation is for. But they make that determination based on truth, not on records someone altered without their knowledge. Whitfield nodded slowly. And the range reforms. I've drafted an initial framework, Rourke said. He handed the general a single page. Every electronic score requires independent physical verification. Instructors are evaluated on safety and judgment, not qualification rates alone. Any candidate may challenge a target identification decision without automatic penalty. Unusual score improvements or mechanical failures trigger mandatory review. He paused. And every candidate must demonstrate when not to shoot, not just how accurately to fire. Whitfield read the page. He read it carefully the way men read things they intend to act on. Then he looked up. The last one, he said, when not to shoot. That was the thing this evaluation revealed most clearly, Rourke said. We've been measuring lethality and calling it readiness. They're related, but they're not identical. The candidate who nearly wasn't selected for this evaluation demonstrated that more clearly than any target score. He paused. I want it in the standard. Whitfield put the page down. Done, he said. All of it. It was for Rourke one of the cleaner moments in a day that had had very few of them. He sat straighter in the chair. There's one more thing, Rourke said. Bennett, Whitfield said. I'd like her involved in the reevaluation process, Rourke said. Formally, as lead assessor for the requalification cycle. Whitfield studied him. You're asking me to bring the woman who exposed a significant institutional failure in your command back into your command in an official capacity. Yes, sir, Rourke said, because she's the best person for the job. And because pretending this range is going to rebuild trust in its evaluation system without the person who demonstrated exactly what honest evaluation looks like would be dishonest. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll make the request to the Training Integrity Office. He left 20 minutes later, and Rourke sat alone for a moment in the supervisor's office, the room where all of this had begun to break open, where Claire had shown him her notebook, and he had looked at 23 altered timestamps and felt the floor of everything he trusted shift beneath him. He sat there and thought about what the range was going to look like in 6 months, in a year, in 5 years. He thought about the instructors who were going to have to learn to evaluate differently, to look for judgment instead of just performance, to create space for the quiet observations that prevented disasters rather than just celebrating the dramatic responses to them. I thought about the 17 soldiers, 19, who were going to come in for honest reevaluation in the coming weeks, who were going to sit down with accurate assessors and discover for the first time the real distance between where they were and where they needed to be. Some of them were going to close that distance quickly. Some were going to struggle. All of them deserved the truth, and Rourke was going to make sure they got it. Torres knocked and came in. She's leaving, he said. Rourke stood immediately. Claire was at the main entrance, her jacket on her notebook in her bag, a vehicle from the Training Integrity Office idling outside. She was speaking with one of the investigators, a final exchange, something about document handoff. And when she saw Rourke coming, she finished the conversation and turned to face him. General Whitfield is requesting your formal involvement in the reevaluation cycle, Rourke said. She looked at him. I heard. I recommended it. I know, she said. Will you accept? She was quiet for a moment. Not uncertain she had already decided he could see that. She was taking the moment to say it the right way, the way she did most things. Yes, she said, but I want to be clear about something. When I come back here, I'm not coming as the person who exposed what went wrong. I'm coming as the person who helps build what goes right. That's why I recommended you, he said. She nodded. Then she said, there's something I want you to do. Tell me. The next time you stand in front of a formation and you ask who the best marksman is, she said, don't wait for the hands. And if there's someone standing at the back watching the wind, walk over to them before the evaluation starts and ask them what they see. He looked at her. That's a different program than the one I've been running. Yes, she said, it is. I was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it would mean to do that, to walk to the back of his own formation and ask the quiet person what they were observing before the competition began. He thought about how much that one change would alter the culture of everything that followed. He thought about the young specialists and junior soldiers who had stood at the back of evaluations for years and watched the hands go up and said nothing, not because they had nothing to say, but because nobody had created an opening for them to say it. The apology that matters, he said slowly, thinking of something she had said the night before, is how you treat the next person standing quietly at the back. She looked at him. You were listening? I was listening, he said. She held his eyes for a moment, and in that moment, Thomas Rourke understood something that he would carry for the rest of his career. That leadership was not the ability to identify people who already looked successful. It was the discipline to notice potential before it was forced to fight for recognition, and that the single most important skill on any range, in any institution, in any organization built by human being, was the willingness to ask what someone saw before deciding you already knew. She turned and walked to the vehicle. She got in without looking back. The door closed. Torres came and stood beside Rourke. They watched the vehicle move down the access road. She'll be back, Torres said. Yes, Rourke said. Range is going to be different. Yes, Rourke said again. He was still looking at the access road. It's going to be harder. Torres looked at him. Harder than what? Rourke thought about it honestly. Harder than running a range where the numbers always look right. He paused. But it's going to be true, and I think that might be the same thing as better. Torres nodded slowly. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. What do we do first? Rourke straightened. We call in the 19 soldiers, he said. One at a time. We sit down with each of them. We tell them what happened to their records, and we tell them what an honest assessment looks like, and we ask them what they need. He paused. We treat them like people who were failed by a system instead of people who failed. And after that, Rourke looked at the range, at the targets still standing in their positions, at the scoring displays, cycling through their standby screens, at the mountain above the tree line where the wind moved the way it always moved, regardless of what happened below. After that, he said, we run an honest evaluation and we see who's actually there. Torres looked at the mountain too. Then he said very quietly the thing that he had been thinking since early that morning when he'd sat with Rourke in the small office at 3 a.m. She never told us her score, he said. In the evaluation, her final composite, she never said what it was. Rourke looked at him. Did anyone check? Torres asked. Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then he walked back inside, found the evaluation coordinator, and pulled Claire Bennett's composite score from the official record. He stood in the middle of the range office and looked at it. Then he laughed. It was a short, genuine, slightly disbelieving laugh, the laugh of a man who has spent 2 days thinking he understood what was happening and has just discovered one final layer he missed. Torres was at his shoulder. Well, Rourke showed him the score. Torres looked at it for a long moment. She won, he said. She won the whole evaluation. By 4 points, Rourke said. She never said a word about it. No, Rourke said, she didn't. He set the paper down. He looked at it for another moment. Because that was never what she came here to prove. And that Thomas Rourke understood standing in the range office, in the afternoon light, with the mountain above them, and the reformed evaluation framework on the general's desk, and 19 names waiting for honest conversations, was the truest and most complete answer he had ever received to the question he had been asking for 11 years. Who is the best marksman, the one who wins and doesn't need to tell you? The 19 conversations took 3 weeks. Rourke did them himself, every single one. He had offered to bring in external counselors, and the investigators had offered to send support personnel, but Rourke had said no to both because this was his range, and these were his soldiers, and the failure had happened on his watch, and he was going to be the one who sat across from each of them and told them the truth. That was not heroism. That was accountability, which is a different thing and considerably less comfortable. The first conversation was the hardest. The soldier's name was Specialist Derek Osei, 24 years old, 2 years in service, a quiet young man from Georgia who had believed for 18 months that he had passed his qualification evaluation on merit. He sat across from Rourke in the supervisor's office and listened, and when Rourke finished explaining what had been in his record and what had been changed and why Osei was silent for a long time. Not the silence of shock, exactly. The silence of a person recalibrating something fundamental. Then he said, so when I deployed to the joint exercise in September, my score said I was ready. Yes, Rourke said, but I wasn't. You weren't there yet, Rourke said carefully. There's a difference between not ready and not there yet. Osei looked at him. What's the difference? Not ready means the ceiling is low, Rourke said. Not there yet means you needed more time and more honest instruction, and someone who told you the truth about where your gaps were, instead of filing paperwork that said they didn't exist. He paused. The ceiling in your case is not low. I've watched you shoot. You have real ability. What you didn't have was accurate feedback. Osei looked at his hands for a moment. I thought I was further along than I was, he said. When things got hard in the field, I thought something was wrong with me. I thought I had, regressed, lost something. He stopped. It wasn't regression. No, Rourke said, it wasn't. I just never had it to begin with. You have it now, Rourke said, in pieces, and with honest work you'll have the rest of it. Osei looked up. His expression was complicated, not relieved, not angry, but the expression of a person who is in the process of replacing a false foundation with a real one, which is never comfortable, even when it's necessary. What do I do now? You come back for honest reevaluation, Rourke said, without a timeline imposed on you, without a quota attached to your result. You come back and you shoot, and we tell you exactly where you are and exactly what you need, and we support you through it. He paused. And your record is corrected to reflect what actually happened. Every stage, the work you actually did. Osei nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay, the kind of okay that is not agreement with circumstances, but acceptance of them, which requires more strength than agreement does. He stood and shook Rourke's hand. His grip was firm. He walked out of the supervisor's office and across the gravel, and Rourke watched him go and felt something in his chest that was not exactly pride and not exactly grief, but lived in the territory between them where honest reckoning tends to produce its most complicated emotions. 18 more conversations, each one different, each one the same in the essential way a person learning that the system that was supposed to support them had quietly failed them and having to decide what to do with that information. Some of them were angry. Rourke let them be angry because anger was a legitimate response and the worst thing he could do was manage it away. Some of them cried. He let that happen too. One senior sergeant, a 12-year veteran who had structured his entire identity around his qualification record, sat in the chair and said nothing for almost 4 minutes, and Rourke sat across from him and waited without filling the silence, because sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is space to feel the weight of something before they decide how to carry it. By the end of the third week, all 19 had a corrected record, a reevaluation appointment, and a written commitment from Rourke's office that their career trajectory would not be penalized for the gap between what Blake had written and what they had actually done. Blake's case moved through the investigative process. He cooperated completely. He documented everything he remembered about every alteration and the reasoning behind it, and the reasoning read in sequence told a story that was genuinely painful in its coherence. A man who had started with a defensible impulse found that the first compromise made the second one easier and kept walking a path that narrowed so gradually he never saw the cliff until he was already past it. I was removed from duty pending formal review. His career, which had been 14 years of genuine service before the 18 months that ended, it was over in the form it had taken. That was correct. And it was also in its way a tragedy of a very specific humankind, the tragedy of a person who was not a villain doing the thing that villains do. The range reforms went into effect on the first Monday of the following month. Torres oversaw the independent verification system. Every electronic score now required a physical confirmation logged by a separate assessor before it was entered into the official record. The process added time to every evaluation cycle. Rourke told the complaining instructors that the time it added was the time it cost to be honest, and that honest things cost something, and that the cost was worth paying. The new instructor evaluation criteria went into effect the same week. Instructors were now assessed on the quality of their safety decisions, the accuracy of their candidate feedback, and their willingness to flag anomalies rather than smooth them over. High pass rates were no longer a metric. The metric was honest outcomes candidates who passed because they had genuinely earned it, and candidates who didn't pass because they had been given accurate information about what they still needed to do. Dawson asked to be included in the instructor training program 3 weeks after the evaluation ended. He came to Rourke's office and he sat down and he said without preamble, "I want to teach. I want to be the kind of instructor that asks the right questions instead of just producing the right numbers." Rourke looked at him for a moment. "That's a harder job than competing." "I know," Dawson said. "You're very good at competing." "I know that too," Dawson said. "But competing is about me being excellent. Teaching is about someone else becoming excellent. He paused. I think I spent a long time believing those were the same thing. They're not. Rourke studied him. He thought about the man who had stepped forward on the first morning with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that someone standing quietly at the back could see something he couldn't. He thought about the man who had stopped his shot when a quiet voice asked him to, when every competitive instinct and every year of earned reputation said to trust the system and fire. You're in, Rourke said. Dawson nodded. He started to stand, then stopped. Can I ask you something? Yes. Her score, Dawson said. Bennett's final composite. Did you ever tell anyone what it was? Torres knows, Rourke said. Did you tell her you found it? Rourke was quiet for a moment. No. Are you going to? Rourke thought about it, about the drive away from the range, the door closing, the vehicle moving down the access road. About a woman who had won an evaluation she attended to investigate a crime and had never mentioned it to anyone. I don't think she'd want me to, he said. Dawson nodded. No, he said. I don't think she would either. He left. Rourke sat alone for a moment, and then he pulled out the reevaluation schedule and got back to work. 6 months after the evaluation at Fort Granite, the new Overwatch unit was activated and deployed for its first real operation. It was not a combat scenario. It was a mountain rescue. A severe early season storm had moved through the range region 2 days faster than the meteorological models predicted, and a series of vehicles on a high elevation access road were stranded with communication towers down and terrain too unstable for standard vehicle approach. The Overwatch unit's assignment was to support evacuation teams from elevated positions, maintain communication relay, and ensure the ground crews could operate safely in deteriorating conditions. Dawson led the field team. He had the 12 soldiers who had passed the honest evaluation, the real one, with corrected records and accurate scores, and an understanding of both their strengths and their actual limits. He briefed them at the staging area with the methodical precision of a man who has learned the difference between confidence that informs and confidence that blinds. The evacuation began at 0700. The first hour was clean. Teams moved into position, communications held. The ground crews began reaching the stranded vehicles. Dawson maintained his Overwatch position and coordinated with the team below. Through clear, specific radio exchanges that Torres monitoring from the operations center, thought sounded different from every Overwatch communication he had heard in 22 years. Not louder, not more decisive, more accurate, less performance, more information. Then at 0840, a specialist named Reyes went quiet on the radio for 30 seconds. 30 seconds is not long. In an active operation, 30 seconds of radio silence from a position is the kind of thing that can be explained a dozen ordinary ways: terrain interference, a stuck push to talk, a moment of repositioning. Dawson had learned in 14 years to treat 30 seconds of silence as ordinary until there was reason to treat it otherwise. He had also learned in the past 6 months to pay attention to the person who was being quiet. Reyes, he said, talk to me. Specialist Carmen Reyes was 22 years old. She had been at Fort Granite for 14 months, and her qualification record before the investigation had contained one of the 19 altered entries. Her honest reevaluation had placed her in the middle of the candidate field. Not exceptional, not struggling, solidly competent in most areas with specific gaps in long-range judgment that the additional training had addressed in 4 weeks. She was by every honest metric ready for this operation. She was also in this moment standing at an elevated position, looking at something that the mission briefing had not prepared her for. Sergeant Dawson, she said. Her voice was careful, the kind of careful that is not hesitation but precision. The ground crew's approach vector to Vehicle 3 runs along the South Ridge Line. Confirmed, Dawson said. The South Ridge Line has water movement under the snow surface, she said. I can see it from my position. The crust looks stable, but the runoff pattern under it has been active. If 6 personnel and 2 vehicles cross that section, how confident are you? Dawson said. She paused. Not because she was uncertain, he realized. Because she was being honest about the nature of her certainty. 70%, she said. I'm not certain, but the pattern is consistent with what we covered in the terrain instability module last month. Dawson looked at the ridge line. He was 400 meters from her position, and he did not have her angle. He could not see what she was seeing. And he had a ground crew that was 60 seconds from beginning their approach and an evacuation timeline that would be significantly disrupted if he stopped them for a judgment call that turned out to be wrong. He felt everything in him pull toward momentum, toward the operational schedule, toward the efficiency of a team that was performing well and did not need to be interrupted. He stopped the convoy. "Ground crew hold at waypoint 4, he said into the radio. "We have a potential terrain instability flag on the South Ridge approach. Give me 2 minutes." The ground crew leader's voice came back with the particular edge of a person whose schedule has just been disrupted. "Dawson, we have a weather window closing in 90 minutes. "I know," Dawson said. "Give me 2 minutes." He called Torres on the operations channel and described what Reyes had reported. Torres contacted the meteorological support team. The meteorologist on call took 45 seconds to run the water movement data against the storm model and came back with a number that landed in Dawson's earpiece like something physical. "If the snow crust on that section is underlain by active lateral runoff," the meteorologist said, "the load capacity is approximately 40% of what a standard winter approach would assume. 6 personnel and 2 vehicles would exceed the safe threshold." Dawson keyed his radio. "Ground crew, you are rerouted to waypoint 6. We are going around the South Ridge." The evacuation took 40 additional minutes. Every vehicle was recovered. Every stranded motorist was moved safely. The weather window closed while the last vehicle was being loaded, and the team worked the final extraction in deteriorating conditions, but they worked it without a terrain collapse and without a casualty, which was the only metric that mattered. When they got back to the staging area, Dawson found Reyes pulling her gear, and he walked over to her, and he said, "That was good work." She looked at him with the slightly uncertain expression of someone who is not sure if the outcome validates the judgment or if the outcome was just luck. "I was only 70%, she said. "You were honest about 70%, he said. "That's different from being 70% and calling it certain." He paused. "If you had been 100% certain and wrong, that would have been a problem. You were 70% certain and correct, and you said exactly what you had and let someone with more information make the call." He looked at her directly. "That is exactly what good judgment looks like." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The training module, the terrain instability section, I almost didn't take notes on it. It seemed theoretical." "Everything seems theoretical until it isn't," Dawson said. "That's why we train." Torres heard the exchange from 10 feet away. He wrote nothing down. He didn't need to. He had spent 22 years in this institution learning to recognize the moments when something was working correctly, and he recognized this one, and he let it stand without annotation. The operations report came back with a commendation for Reyes's terrain assessment and for Dawson's decision to halt and verify. Rourke read the report in his office, and then he did something he had not done in 11 years of command. He forwarded it without editorial comment directly to the Training Integrity Office with a single line attached. This is what the reformed evaluation produced. He got a response the same afternoon. It was brief. It said, "We see it." He knew the response had come from Claire's office, though it was not signed with her name. 1 year after the evaluation, Fort Granite held its next major qualification cycle. The range looked from the outside identical to how it had always looked. The equipment was the same, the mountain was the same, the targets stood at the same distances, and the wind moved through the same valley in the same unpredictable patterns that had always made this range one of the more demanding in the region. But the process was different. Every stage had a dual verification component. Every instructor had been retrained on feedback quality. The candidate packets included for the first time a section on judgment-based decision-making that required candidates to document not just their shots, but their reasoning why they fired, why they waited, what they saw that others might have missed. And at the beginning of the evaluation, Rourke stood in front of the new group of candidates and asked his question. "Who is the best marksman here?" He waited. This time the silence that followed was not the competitive pause of people deciding whether to raise their hand. It was the genuine silence of people who had been told in their pre-evaluation briefing what this question had meant and what it was really asking. The story of the evaluation 12 months ago had moved through Fort Granite's training culture, the way significant events move through institutions, not officially, not in any manual or policy document, but in the specific way that soldiers talk to each other when something true happened and they want to make sure it doesn't get forgotten. No hands went up. Rourke nodded. Then he walked to the back of the formation. He had decided to do this 3 months ago, had practiced it mentally, had thought about how it would land, had prepared himself for the possibility that there would be nobody at the back worth walking to, that the gesture would be empty. There was a young woman at the back, second row from the last standing, slightly to the left, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at the thermometer on the range safety post, and then at the ridge line, and then at the flag near the forward position, and she had a small notebook held flat against her left forearm, and she was writing. Rourke walked to her. She looked up when he stopped, and her expression was startled. Not frightened, but genuinely surprised, the kind of surprise that comes when someone does something you did not predict in an environment where most things are predictable. "What are you seeing?" Rourke asked. He asked it the way he had practiced it, without condescension, without test in his voice, without the implied challenge that turns a question into a trap. He asked it the way a person asks when they genuinely want to know. She blinked. Then she said carefully, "The temperature gradient between the valley floor and the ridge is wider than what the morning report showed. That's going to affect bullet drop on anything past 600 meters. And the wind is shifting counterclockwise, which means the crosswind correction from the primary position is going to change about halfway through the first stage." Rourke looked at the ridge. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the flag. She was right about all of it. He turned back to her. "What's your name?" "Private First Class Medina, Sergeant Major." "Medina," he said, "when we begin the evaluation, I want you to share what you just told me with the group. Not because you need permission to be right, because the group needs to hear it." Her expression changed. It was a small change, not dramatic, not cinematic, but it was the specific change that happens to a face when someone has been waiting to be asked for something and finally for the first time is being asked. "Yes, Sergeant Major," she said. He walked back to the front. He stood in front of the formation and he thought about a morning 12 months ago when he had done the opposite of this, when he had looked at the person at the back and seen irrelevance instead of observation. Performance instead of precision, the absence of noise instead of the presence of thought. He thought about the cost of that instinct and the people that it had harmed directly and indirectly over the years he had let it govern his program. I thought about Claire Bennett standing in a vehicle looking straight ahead as she drove down the access road, carrying a composite score she had never mentioned to anyone, having done the things she came to do. I thought about Osei, who had come back for his honest reevaluation 8 weeks after their conversation, and who had passed it genuinely, completely with real scores, in real confirmation, in the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who knows that what they earned is actually theirs. I thought about Torres checking the access log at 5:30 in the morning and handing him a folded piece of paper with the original exercise schedule on it. He thought about Dawson stepping out of the primary position without argument. He thought about Reyes saying 70% with the honesty of a person who had been taught that accurate uncertainty is more valuable than confident wrong. I thought about 2 people injured in a helicopter exercise and a gap between what records said and what people could do. And he thought about the responsibility of institutions to close that gap with honesty rather than paperwork. Then he looked at his formation, 40 new candidates, different faces, the same mountain, the same wind, and he said what he had decided to say. The best marksman in this evaluation will not be the one who fires the most rounds. It will not be the one who scores highest when the stages end. It will not be the one who announces their ability the loudest or who looks the most ready from the outside. Darn. He paused. The best marksman will be the one who understands the cost of every shot, who sees what others are not looking at, who tells the truth about what they know and what they don't, and who, when it matters most, has the judgment to put the weapon down. He looked at Medina at the back of the formation. She was writing in her notebook. He turned back to the range. At Fort Granite 6 months later, Private First Class Medina passed her full qualification evaluation with an honest score that placed her in the top third of her candidate group. Not the top third, which was exactly where she was, and which she knew was exactly where she was, and which gave her a specific and accurate understanding of what she needed to do next. Her instructor wrote in her evaluation record, "Exceptional situational awareness. Demonstrates consistent, judgment-based decision-making. Strong candidate for advanced marksmanship assessment within 12 months. Recommend for Overwatch program consideration." Her instructor was Luke Dawson. The notation was verified independently by Raymond Torres. And somewhere else in the country, in a different installation on a different mountain range, Major Claire Bennett was standing at the back of a new formation in a plain training jacket with her rank covered, watching the wind move through unfamiliar trees, writing in a notebook that nobody had asked about yet. She was waiting. She was always waiting, not with impatience, not with performance, but with the particular patience of someone who understands that the truth tends to reveal itself to the person who is willing to stand still and look at it long enough, and who has learned through years of doing exactly this work in exactly this way, that the most important things in any institution are almost never the things that announce themselves loudly. They are the thing that stand at the back and watch the wind and wait to be asked what they see. And the best leaders, the ones who build something that lasts, the ones whose ranges and teams and programs continue to tell the truth. Truth long after they are gone, and are the ones who learn to walk to the back before the evaluation starts, before the hands go up, before the obvious answer walks to the front of the room and fills all the available space with its certainty. They walk to the back. They ask, and then they listen. That is what it means to see. That is what it means to lead. And that is what it means, finally and completely, to be the best marksman in the room. Not the one who never misses, but the one who never stops asking what they might have missed.